So it was an August Sunday morning, and I went in to make rounds in the cardiac care unit at San Francisco General Hospital. And the intern and resident who were rounding with me started laughing quite hysterically and saying, "You won't believe this next patient." And there was a 52-year-old man lying in the bed, wide awake. And I learned that the night before he had had a cardiac arrest and his family did not know CPR, but they took the common household plunger and they plunged his chest.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Health Technology Podcast. My name is Christine Winota, and I'm the director of UCSF Rosamond Institute at the University of California, San Francisco. Our guest today is Dr. Keith Lurie. As you probably guessed, his specialty is cardiac resuscitation. Dr. Lurie is a professor of emergency medicine and internal medicine at the University of Minnesota, and also a co-founder and chief medical officer at Advanced Circulatory Solutions, which was acquired in 2014 by ZOLL Medical Corporation. Over the past 30 years, Dr. Lurie has developed novel ways to resuscitate heart attack patients. One of his many innovations, the rescue pump, was indeed based on that toilet plunger. The rescue pump is part of a system that, according to the FDA, is the first and only CPR device indicated to improve the likelihood of surviving cardiac arrest. Dr. Lurie started out on a purely academic track, but in our chat today, you'll hear how the toilet plunger incident put him on the path to a long series of innovation and commercial success. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of his career is that he has saved the life of many people who have become his friends. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and if you like what you hear today, please subscribe to our podcast in iTunes. Well, thank you for joining me this afternoon. You're joining me from Minnesota, Minneapolis, and we met last month when you were here to present about on your latest project that you're working on, the Advanced CPR solution. But before we start talking about the technology that you're developing, I thought it would be good for our listeners to hear about your background. I know you're a practicing cardiac electrophysiologist in Minnesota. And so can you tell us how you get there? I know you spent some time here in the Bay Area, and what's your career transition from here to Minnesota, and what drives you to take on that particular field?
Sure. Let me just introduce myself. My name is Keith Lurie, and I did head out to California from college back in 1978, and I went to medical school at Stanford. And when I applied to medical school and was admitted, I learned that I'd have to work part-time in order to be able to afford to go to medical school. And Stanford had a wonderful program that enabled me to work for 20 hours a week, and they would pay for my tuition and more. And I really got hooked at Stanford on cardiovascular research. I had the opportunity to work with some superb people in cardiology and members of the Shumway heart transplant team. And I actually spent an extra year at Stanford as a postdoctoral fellow in cardiovascular pharmacology. So at that time, I was already quite interested in the heart and heart disease. And I completed my residency and then was able to go to the University of California in San Francisco for my cardiology fellowship and electrophysiology training. And I also simultaneously joined the faculty, as I had been awarded a physician scientist award for some work on the cardiac induction system. And I had what I thought was a pretty straightforward career path as an academic cardiologist with a focus in heart rhythm disorders, until one day in 1988, when I was a junior attending at San Francisco General Hospital. And that's really when my focus changed from general cardiology to resuscitation.
And what moment that triggered you to make that change?
So it was an August Sunday morning, and I went in to make rounds in the cardiac care unit at San Francisco General Hospital. And the intern and resident who were rounding with me started laughing quite hysterically and saying, "You won't believe this next patient." And there was a 52-year-old man lying in the bed, wide awake. And I learned that the night before he had had a cardiac arrest, and his family did not know CPR, but they took the common household plunger and they plunged his chest.
Okay.
And indeed, it was a funny story. And it turns out that they had done it 2 weeks earlier and about 2 weeks before that. But the man could not afford healthcare. He was a so-called medically indigent adult. He was from Iran. And so he never got his coronary artery fixed until the time that I saw him. And so there was this patient who was wide awake in the sun saying to us, "Hey, doc, you need a toilet plunger at the end of every CCU bed." So we left the room and made sure he got an angiogram and got his coronary artery fixed. And after laughing some more, we realized that there may be something that's really interesting, because in 1988, nobody wanted to do mouth-to-mouth during CPR. And the idea of turning the chest from a passive bellows to an active bellows and actually pulling up on the chest and having air rush in may be a way that we could do CPR with a tool that prevented the need or basically got rid of the need for mouth-to-mouth.
So it's the son who used the plunger. He didn't perform the CPR. He just did the plunging onto the mouth.
Correct. They plunged the dad's chest, and so we wrote a little letter that ultimately was published in JAMA. That is the intern resident and I, entitled "CPR." The P stands for Plumber's Helper. And the day it came out, they asked me to go on Good Morning America. And I said, "No, I'm not going on Good Morning America to talk about a toilet plunger. That'd be the end of my academic career." Well, I showed up at work, and CNN and ABC and all the networks were there. And that sort of was the end of my academic career at the University of California in San Francisco, but not the end of my academic career, because this case went around the world and it became popularized. And one of my colleagues at UC, Todd Cohn, said that I should patent it. And I said, "Well, I know nothing about patenting anything," but that was my introduction. And Todd and I ultimately worked with the University of California to patent a device and a method to push down and pull up on the chest to enhance circulation. And this would be guided with a force gauge and a metronome and a handle. And that technology was picked up by a company called Ambu that makes resuscitation bags, including the so-called Ambu bag. And that was really the beginning of what has been effectively a 30-year journey.
Okay, so that was your first invention that you came up with.
Well, it was sort of handed to us, and we actually tried to track down the family who disappeared, although the patient did well. That much I know.
And so till this day, people still use that?
Well, that plunger concept has evolved over the last 30 years a lot. I would say the most popular use is a plunger on the end of an automated piston device called the Lucas device, which is manufactured by the Stryker Corporation now. And they are used in about 20 to 25% of all cardiac arrests in the United States. A handheld version of that is something that I was personally very involved with because we started to test this when I moved to the University of Minnesota, where I joined the faculty and have been a professor ever since. And at the University of Minnesota, we realized that when you push down and pull up with a suction cup, while you move a lot of air with that approach, what you really need in order to improve survival rates is you need to move more blood. And we made a discovery in the early 1990s while testing this suction cup device that if you impede air or block air from rushing into the lungs when you're pulling up with this suction cup device, then you create a vacuum inside the thorax that sucks more blood back into the heart, and it actually sucks venous blood out of the brain. So you lower intracranial pressure and you enhance forward flow, ultimately because you refill the heart and you can actually triple blood flow to the heart and the brain compared to a pair of hands.
Mm.
So that discovery was made in around 1994, 1995. And we went to the University of Minnesota and said, we have this really exciting finding, which we can triple blood flow to the heart and the brain during CPR. And they told me they weren't interested because we had proposed to block the airway with this valve-like system. So we did some further studies in animals and confirmed that this was really a breakthrough. And ultimately, with great reluctance, as an academic, my wife and I and the co-inventor of the impedance threshold device, we call it the ITD, formed a company. And we formed that in 1997. And ultimately tested the technology in humans with a lot of support from the NIH. We received millions of dollars in NIH SBIR awards, and ultimately were successful in getting this technology through the FDA as the first device ever indicated increase the likelihood of survival after cardiac arrest. So we feel really good about that. And this technology and the company was actually ultimately bought by ZOLL Medical about 4.5 years ago.
Okay. And the University of Minnesota didn't own any of the IP?
Correct. The University of California actually did very well with the active compression-decompression CPR patent on the plunger. University of Minnesota passed on the idea. But I can say that here in Minnesota, because of the activity that I've been involved with and other colleagues, we do have very high survival rates using that technology. The highest survival of any state in the country, actually.
Oh, okay. And I know that the product that you have, the rescue pod that's acquired by ZOLL, in 2015, it was selected as one of the chosen EMS 10, one of the 10 best product of the year, I suppose. So that says something about the efficacy of that product. And so since then, you've been so interested in the whole business of resuscitating because of the plunger. Is there some personal reason behind it that you want to be in that space, or it just happened that you see a lot of patients there, and then this is the sort of thing that you are interested?
So I don't have any personal story that led me to being interested in this space, but over the last 30 years, what's happened is I've become friends, actually, with a lot of patients who have been fortunate to have been resuscitated after cardiac arrest. And as a cardiac electrophysiologist, I began to specialize in those patients and make sure that they receive the proper care. So we were some of the first in the country to introduce the concept of therapeutic hypothermia or cooling patients after cardiac arrest, and realizing that in order to survive a cardiac arrest, you just couldn't be treated with a single device like a defibrillator or a rescue pod or a plunger, but really a bundle of care was needed. And I've been quite involved with trying to understand and perfect that bundle of care and try to understand what it takes to change a community from just using a pair of hands only to implementing a bundle of care to improve outcomes. And that's been very gratifying because then not only have I been exposed to a lot of colleagues, both in EMS and in universities around the world, but also I get to know a bunch of patients. One patient really comes to mind. He's actually a professor at the University of Wisconsin, who, when he was being treated with a combination of the rescue pod device that impedes air into the lungs during CPR and the manual rescue pump, he received about a minute or so of CPR after he had his cardiac arrest while he was driving to the hospital after developing chest pain at the gym. So he's getting CPR and he turns to the paramedic and says, I think you can stop doing CPR now. And the paramedic had never had a patient talk before while he was delivering CPR, and they stopped doing CPR and the patient became comatose again. And he realized that there was enough blood getting this guy's brain that he could talk, but he was still in cardiac arrest. And ultimately, he was resuscitated. Ultimately, he's become a friend and colleague and has been part of a movement that is nationwide called the Take Heart America program, which is actually a pretty strong chapter in Alameda County in California. But this is a program that really embraces the bundle of care approach. So not a personal connection, Christine, but now a lot of personal connections.
Yeah. So in this situation, like what kind of bundle of care? I mean, is there like a standard bundle of care now that's currently being used, or is it still in flux?
Well, there is a standard bundle of recommended care, and I like to think about it in terms of 4 pieces of the bundle. There's the piece that happens when 911 is called, and ideally, somebody should receive instructions if they don't know CPR from the dispatcher immediately, not with a long delay. And more recently, there have been a number of smartphone applications that can get people to the patient in cardiac arrest who are in the vicinity very rapidly. One of the programs was actually developed out of Alameda County called PulsePoint. That's a company. You get a cell phone app, and you get notified that somebody down the road is in cardiac arrest, and if you're within 500 feet, you're either told to get the AED or told to go to the arrest. So that's the first bundle. You start chest compressions right away. But once go ahead.
Is for this particular app, is the 911 people who are making that outreach to the people who signed up for the app, or is the patient family who call 911 who has to know about this?
The patient's family calls 911, and then anybody who signed up for the app, often medical people, but also lay rescuers, then could be notified
by the 911.
Yeah, this company coordinates their activation with the 911 dispatch system.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
So that's bundle 1, the first part of the bundle. The second is what happens when the first responders, the police and fire, arrive. And when they arrive, I use an example in Anoka County here in Minnesota. When police arrive, they're actually carrying the system that we got through the FDA. They have a little first responder bag that includes a defibrillator, the rescue pump with a manual suction cup device, and they also carry the rescue pod, this impedance threshold device, a face mask, and a bag. And when they arrive, they start chest compressions right away. But as soon as they have 2 people, they use this new technology to increase circulation and increase the likelihood of survival. So the patient actually may get resuscitated by the police or fire in Anoka County before advanced life support of the ambulance arrives. And that has happened on more than one occasion. That's another patient recently that I got to know very well, a wonderful man who does custom automobiles, but he was resuscitated by police on a tennis court when he went down before the advanced life support teams arrived. But when the advanced life support teams arrive, not only do they bring all the technology I just talked about, but they bring more sophisticated defibrillators. They often bring automated CPR devices, and they also bring ways to deliver drugs more efficiently. So this is the third sort of part of the bundle, the advanced life support portion. And then once you have somebody back, and we typically will work them at the scene, you'll bring them to the hospital. And in the hospital, they will be treated. If they're still in cardiac arrest, they now may get heart-lung bypass or so-called extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. And they also will get therapeutic hypothermia treatment with devices to cool down the body to provide protection from the damage done when there was no flow to the brain and the heart. About 24 hours later, they get rewarmed. And even before they get cooled, they're usually brought to a cardiac catheterization laboratory to see if they have any blockages. And if so, the critical lesions are treated. And then there's a recovery period. So those 4 portions of the bundle, before professional responders arrive, then the first responders, advanced life support, and the hospital care are part of the system of care that we've been promoting. We actually had our first State of the Future of Resuscitation meeting in Berkeley last October, sort of featuring this bundle, and we're having our next one in October in Paris of this year. So this is an idea that has really caught on in the space because we realize this is a complex disease. And just like any other complex disease, whether it's cancer or an HIV infection or heart failure, you need a multi-pronged approach. And so there's an opportunity for innovation within each of those prongs of the approach. And I've been focusing primarily on how you save the brain and how you improve circulation. And that's been a passion and a focus. And I thought I was sort of done when I finished with this plunger, the rescue pump, and the rescue pod, but I was wrong.
This podcast is sponsored by IO Life Science, a Silicon Valley-based medtech design and development consultancy, transforming your technologies into a unique healthcare solution. For more information, visit their website at iolifescience.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Brown Ratnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that helps life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownratnick.com. So what things that you saw that you think that there's still a need for a new technology to add into the bundle of care?
So after we got done with our FDA PMA application, which was quite a challenge, we were successful. We realized that we were still losing 80 to 90% of all patients with an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And we were still losing upwards of 75% of all patients with an in-hospital cardiac arrest. And collectively in the United States, that means we're losing about 500,000 people a year who may still have a shot at being resuscitated. And we had a discovery moment about 5 years ago. I was visiting in Korea, and I was a visiting professor at Seoul National University in Korea one day, and I presented a lot of the story in a little more scientific detail that I've just provided on this podcast. And then I was listening to what the Koreans were doing and some of their challenges. And they have about 10 million people in the city of Seoul. And many of these people live in 40-story high apartment buildings. And because of the challenges that EMS has there, it's very difficult to get into a small elevator with a lot of equipment and get up the elevator to one of the floors and get into a patient's room and try to resuscitate somebody and then bring them down in the elevator. They have a whopping 0% survival if you have a cardiac arrest above the 10th floor. Mm-hmm. And their overall survival rates with good neurologic function to this day in Seoul, Korea, are less than 5%.
Wow.
So they were trying to develop a way to get people up and down the elevator, and they had a stretcher that they had created, and they put the person in cardiac arrest on the stretcher and then put the feet straight up in the air, and they did CPR with an automated device on the patient's chest.
Upside down.
This was sort of a prototype that they presented to me, and I turned to my friend and I said, I think you're going to kill people like that. You need to put the head up or have an easy chair. So he looked at me and said, no, we need to have the venous blood from the legs go refill the heart. I said, no, the venous blood will not stop at the heart. It will go right up to the brain, and it will increase intracranial pressure and brain pressures, and that will kill people. And we went round and around, and ultimately he came to my laboratory with his team about 5 years ago, and here in Minnesota at Hennepin County Medical Center, where I work and have a laboratory that's part of the university and part of Hennepin, we did a very exciting experiment. We took an animal. We used a pig model, and we've used an animal model for a long time. And we tilted the pig so the head was down and the feet were up in cardiac arrest, and demonstrated that that was really lethal. The intracranial pressure was sky high. But when we tilted the pig with the head up and the feet down, the intracranial pressure fell more than I realized it would. And the brain perfusion increased. And then the pig started to gasp spontaneously, breathing on its own. And we sort of gasped because we know that if you do start to breathe on your own during CPR, it's associated with a very positive outcome. And to put it in perspective, if you have a shockable rhythm, that is something that you can use a defibrillator on to shock, so ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation during CPR, and you are gasping or have so-called agonal respirations, you have a 57 times higher likelihood of surviving a year with good neurologic function than if you don't gasp and don't have a shockable rhythm. So if all of a sudden we had a way to increase gasping, that was a real step forward. Mm-hmm. And so for the last 4 years, we've been pursuing the science of elevating the head, and more recently the head and the thorax during CPR. And we think this is a major breakthrough in the field.
So the idea the patient is still lying down, but slightly being elevated, or is it more, I'm just thinking about being in that elevator that people almost have to almost slant it, almost standing up. Is it not the case here?
Well, we sort of moved beyond the elevator, Christine. I think we know how we can get people up and down an elevator or on a stretcher by tilting the head up. Okay. But this led to a fundamental discovery, which is that we could do much better if we elevated the head and the heart during CPR proper. But it's a challenge because if you have to pump blood uphill to the head, you have to use more than a pair of hands. Because as I described earlier, we tripled the blood flow to the heart and the brain with a combination of the suction cup device, so-called rescue pump, and our impedance threshold device compared to a pair of hands. So you need to have enough blood flow to pump blood uphill. But if you use those so-called circulatory enhancers, then you can afford to elevate the head, drain the venous blood out of the brain, and also basically clear the brain so that there's less resistance to forward flow. And over the last 4 years, we've discovered that elevating the head and the heart basically mimics what we do in other disease states. For example, if you have brain injury and you come in because of, let's say, a motor vehicle accident, you had a severe brain injury, typically the neurosurgeons will elevate your head 30 degrees because that lowers intracranial pressure because gravity pulls venous blood out of your brain. Mm-hmm. But that requires adequate forward flow or a reasonable mean arterial pressure. So we do that already in patients not in cardiac arrest, but with brain injury. And in fact, a patient with cardiac arrest has brain injury. They have brain injury because they don't have enough blood to their brain. And they also, it turns out, basically get what I like to call a concussion with every compression. Because if you have a patient and you push down on their chest when their chest is flat, an arterial pressure wave goes to the brain to deliver blood, but a venous wave also goes up the venous side, sort of retrograde or backwards to the brain, and the brain gets squished in between these pressure waves. You get rid of that when you start to elevate the head. In addition, if you think about a patient with heart failure, they like to sit up because they can breathe better. When they sit up, their diaphragms drop, their lungs can open up more, and they have better circulation through the lungs, and they have less congestion. So if we elevate the heart some and the brain some, we basically mimic what we do when we have a patient with brain injury or what a patient does with heart failure. But it turns out it's not so straightforward. If you put a patient on a stretcher and just elevate the head, then over time, all the blood wants to go down to the feet. So we don't want that. And if you just put a pillow underneath the head, you don't get the increase in circulation that you get when you elevate the thorax. And if you're using an automated CPR device, you don't want that migrating up and down the chest as you elevate the head and the thorax. And so over the course of the last several years, we've also discovered that if you come up slowly in a certain sequence, you can basically normalize cerebral perfusion pressures, that is, normalize blood flow to the brain over a prolonged period of time by taking advantage of gravity and this discovery. And that's why we started Advanced CPR Solutions, because we realized that there was a better way to improve blood flow to the heart and the brain by what we call device-assisted sequential elevation of the head and the heart. Okay. And that's the technology that we're just launching.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you can give us a quick overview of what that product is like and how it works.
So there are several ways that we educate people about this technology. So sort of so-called conviction validity, or how do people know it works?
Mm-hmm.
So the method that has been most beneficial from my perspective in the past, when we introduced our previous devices, was to demonstrate the physiology in an animal model or a human cadaver. And so we have both animal model and human cadaver. The animal studies are ongoing, so people will observe a study and they'll observe the physiologic benefits. And we actually developed a human cadaver model to show what happens to intracranial pressure and pressures in the heart and the brain when you elevate the head and thorax, and it's quite striking. This approach has been used by others. For example, the CEO of our company introduced a way to get blood and drugs into the veins very rapidly using a so-called intraosseous drug delivery system. And he was the CEO of a company called VitaCare that introduced this with a device called the EZ-IO, which is now in every EMS rig around the country and in many EDs and other places and hospitals. And they demonstrated in animals how easy it was to get intravenous access with this EZ-IO versus trying to find an IV and somebody who doesn't have any blood pressure. So he approached this quite differently than I had approached our CPR devices with a big randomized prospective trial. And we're trying to do a mix of that, Christine. So we're looking for about 200 patient uses by the end of the year, and we'll use historical controls, so all the places that are evaluating this independently. So there's not a big trial. These are independent evaluations by multiple places. We'll compare the historical control data to data with the use of the Eligard. But we're also looking for some other things. We're looking for more signs of life. We're looking for earlier gasping. And we're looking, ultimately, we'll be looking at cerebral oxygenation, how much oxygen is delivered to the brain. We have a study that's planned in Grenoble that's a little more rigorous, where we'll have a sister city that doesn't do anything for a while they implement this whole bundle of care in Grenoble, because they don't use a lot of the technologies that are available. So we're going to introduce the combination of the Eligard, active compression-decompression, the rescue pod, and compare it to what they've been doing with a sister city, and then the sister city will come on board in a so-called step wedge design. But then there are other places in the United States who have heard about this, as this is a topic that has captivated the imagination of a lot of people in EMS. We realize that in retrospect that it makes total sense to elevate the head, but you need to have the right technology to do it. And so a number of EMS systems have said, we want to use it, we want to try it, we want to buy it. And so we're proceeding with that. And these are not small systems. For example, I was on the phone with folks from Miami this week, and they recently implemented the device that cleared the FDA, and they saw a doubling of their survival rate, and they want to keep going with the next innovation. So it's an exciting time right now in the resuscitation space.
Yeah, no, I think it's like the number of people who die in this country because of that is still very high. So that would be really good to see some better product out there to help improve the survival rate. This podcast is sponsored by IO Life Science, a Silicon Valley-based medtech design and development consultancy, transforming your technologies into a unique healthcare solution. For more information, visit their website at iolifescience.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Brown Rudnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that helps life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownrudnick.com. So you have the experience of inventing the product, had it licensed, and then start a company, got acquired, and now you're taking on the next thing. It's like, what are the lessons learned that you learned throughout this experience, and now you're in the latest project? What are the things that you learned, and things that you knew back then still apply now, or you knew back then doesn't apply anymore?
Well, you have to be a little crazy to do this, to be quite frank. So, because there are lots of other things we can do with your time. But if you're passionate about it and you really love the science, and I have both of those sort of ingredients in my DNA, and then you start seeing results, then it becomes somewhat addictive. Mm-hmm. So, what have I learned? I think patience is really required, and tenacity is really required, because you go through periods where it's very exciting, and then you go through periods where you wonder where you're going to have enough funding to get to the next level. And even if you believe in it with your heart and soul, you've got to find somebody else to convince them to support it. And this is really the part of the history of innovation. If you read Elon Musk's biography, nobody wanted to support an electric car. If you look at Earl Bakken with the first pacemaker, nobody wanted to support a pacemaker. If you look at the first AED, nobody believed that anybody would want an AED. And now there are, in every wall in multiple airports at multiple places, and they contribute to saving lives. All of these sort of innovations go through this. So you have to be passionate, patient, tenacious. You got to get a little lucky. Mm-hmm. And you also have to work with people who are similarly passionate. So the team is really, really important.
And how do you find your team?
Again, there's a little bit of luck involved. With the current team that we've assembled for the Eligard, I was very fortunate to be able to team up with the man who brought the EZ-IO into this world. So he did not do the randomized prospective trial approach. He had tried that in a previous life when he was running a division in a pharmaceutical company, and he had a very promising oncology drug. And the study was botched and the drug never got out. So he became anti-study. And we've certainly seen that in the EMS space. The rescue pod itself was very promising by itself with a pair of hands. And the NIH evaluated it, and the study was neutral. And that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine. That was devastating. Mm-hmm. Only in retrospect did we realize that more than half the patients got really poor quality CPR way outside of the range that they were supposed to get, way outside of what we had tested. And when that whole data set was reanalyzed, it became clear that the ITD rescue pod worked great with high quality CPR, and it didn't work very well with poor quality CPR. Some would argue it was actually harmful. Mm-hmm. So you realize that whatever you introduce into the medical world, it could be like a scalpel. It can, cut to save a life, or it could be dangerous. So one of the things that I've learned in the course of trying to do these evaluations is you really have to make sure that where you do your evaluations, whether it's a formal clinical trial or the evaluation of the devices we're doing now, we need to spend a lot of time to make sure that the quality of the care surrounding the device is really high quality. And that is challenging inside the hospital or outside the hospital. I put in pacemakers and defibrillators as a clinician, and I spent a long time learning how to do that, so I have a very low complication rate. But I do that on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. And in the field of cardiac arrest, for example, even though it is one of the top 3 leading causes of death, sudden death in the United States, with some 400 to 500 out-of-hospital cardiac arrests per year, most people in EMS maybe do CPR once or twice a year. So how do you keep their skills up so they know how to do high-quality CPR? That's one of the reasons the machines are a benefit, but they still have to know how to use the machines. So the team and making sure that the surrounding activities that surround the product that you're introducing, they have to be done really well.
Mm-hmm. I'm just surprised to hear that the EMS team don't do it as often, considering how many people have the sudden cardiac arrest.
This is not just true for CPR. If you think about a process that's often done by EMS, it's called intubation, endotracheal intubation, where you put a breathing tube down somebody's trachea. That requires a certain amount of skill. And if you have, let's say, 400 paramedics in Oklahoma City, and you only have 1,000 intubations a year, that means that on average, they get 2.5 intubations. And that skill requires practice. And if you don't have the resources and mannequins or a simulation lab to make sure everybody is top notch at that skill, then they can fumble when in the heat of the moment, they've got to not fumble, but, work precisely. And that can contribute to poor outcomes from intubation. And if intubation is part of a cardiac arrest care package, which it often is, then you can see how this can really sort of have a domino effect.
Mm-hmm. So I know you're in the midst of your fundraising for this company. The idea is using the fund to do more study, to get commercial adoption. Is that what's the plan? What's
Correct.
the plan?
Yeah, we've raised a little over $5 million so far to demonstrate proof of concept in our animal lab. So now we know we can nearly normalize cerebral perfusion pressures. The survival studies in our animal lab have demonstrated a 6-fold increase in neurologically sound survival compared with perfect standard CPR flat. And we've also demonstrated some other things. We developed a human cadaver model so we could build the eligard. We then prototyped the eligard and have manufactured the eligard. We spent additional money on being able to understand how we could sell the device in the United States. It's cleared as a patient positioning device akin to a stretcher or a backboard, but it can be used during CPR to elevate the head for airway management or CPR. And we've also spent money on both manufacturing and securing the intellectual property, the patents. So our next efforts now are really in the evaluation and commercialization phase. And so that's what we're trying to raise money for now, so that we can actually launch a successful business, which all by itself requires a tremendous amount of money. So we have a number of interested strategic partners who are in the resuscitation space, but at least at the moment, they're all sort of waiting and seeing, which is also quite typical of innovation across all spheres. It's
the brave one who's always jumped in first, right? That's what the innovator is supposed to do.
Yeah, it's the idea is cutting edge, not bleeding edge.
Yeah. So now, when you look back to your, career in the clinical, now also in the entrepreneur, what are the things that you think that you look back? It was like that was something that I would always remember for the rest of my life.
Well, you remember the firsts, I would say. So I remember the first time that the plunger was used in a patient in St. Paul, Minnesota, just alone. And it was used on a man who collapsed on a dock on the Mississippi River. And he woke up, and the recording on the defibrillator captured his message, which was, "Get this effing thing off my chest." So I remember the first time I developed a coronary sinus catheter, in part because I used to have time trials with my colleague Todd Cohn, who showed me how to do submit a patent at the University of California. But when we were both fellows with Mel Scheinman there, we needed to get into the coronary sinus, and we used to do time trials to get into the great vein of the heart. When I came to Minnesota, I gave the engineers at one of the local companies an idea for a catheter design that is a way to get into the great cardiac vein. And that became a very important product for that company, now owned by Abbott. But it also provided a way for us to get into the left heart when we do pacemaker implants. And I ended up putting the very first left ventricular pacing system in the country back in 1996. And Ruby Carlson was our patient, and I can mention her name since we wrote about it. But she was 78, and she couldn't get out of bed because of her severe heart failure. And she got the operation, and she was walking around the next day. That was pretty awesome. And she came back a month later, and she was with her daughter. And her daughter said, Mom's doing great, but she got lost last week. I said, what do you mean she got lost? And the daughter said, well, we found her down at the Dairy Queen with her boyfriend from 1936. So you remember these stories, right? So these are really gratifying. And, most recently, a number of patients, including Steve Dunn, the University of Wisconsin business professor, who said you can stop doing CPR now. I think that in a space like resuscitation, where so few people live, when you get to talk to some of the people who live, it's very gratifying. There's a man named Mr. Taylor who was resuscitated in Palm Beach County with the entire bundle of care that I described, including with his head up on a stretcher. And he called me about 3 weeks ago and he said, I've been in the air conditioning business for the last 20 years. I'm a distributor and I want to start distributing medical devices. And his name is Andy Taylor. He said, I'm very smart. I can switch from pressurized systems with heating and air conditioner to pressurized body parts. and I want to work with you guys. Will you help? That's pretty rewarding, Christine.
Yeah, I think that's great. No, this is good. That's a good story. And I think that helps keep you going. As you mentioned, sometimes there's the down moment that things are not as exciting. And sometimes there's the exciting moments. So this is something that can always lift all of us up when, working in this space.
It strikes close to home.
Yeah.
We lost a neighbor a couple of years ago who was an extraordinary man. And that was terrible. And then we had a cardiac electrophysiology fellow here during our evaluation of our CPR technology. And at age 37, he collapsed running around Lake Calhoun and was brought in as a John Doe. And he was our fellow at the university. He now practices cardiac electrophysiology. He's completely intact. There are a lot of highs and plenty of lows too. But at the end of the day, you just got to make sure your shock absorbers work.
Right.
Most of the time, but not always, mine work pretty well.
Yeah, no, that's good. No, this is great. Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing your story. That's so wonderful to hear.
Thank you, Christine.